gentlemen, welcome to the Shadow Priest Guide. Are you ready to surrender to the madness? Maybe not, but even if you don't intend to play one full time, I gotta tell you, this thing's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun when it gets going, and it's very off-putting in the early days, so I'm hoping you guys might give it a shout. Let's look at the Shadow Priest. The Shadow Priest then, dramatic changes in Legion once again, not surprising. A lot of classes got revamped, as did Dis. Holy had a lot of work done to it, and the Shadow was no different. Getting rid of Shadow Orbs, which you might remember from Warlords of Draenor, and I believe Shadow Orbs were a Mists of Pandaria. I can't quite remember that far back. But now we're looking at Insanity. So there is some interesting names that go along with this stuff, and most of it revolves around the theme of picking up Xalatath, actually, the artifact weapon. I love the theme of the Shadow Priest. This dagger, if those of you are not into the lore, you can be forgiven for actually missing out on this, but I suggest you do look into it at some point. It's a cool little story. This dagger is murdered and been used in rituals for a long time, and it craves death. It craves death. It's definitely one of the more interesting artifact weapons in the game, in my opinion, and I certainly recommend that you check it out. So how does this play? Let's look at our stats first of all, and when we talk about the stats, actually a lot of things are going to make more sense. Our stats are going to be focused on haste, and that is because we're trying to generate insanity. We want to generate insanity as quickly and as efficient as possible, and that's going to play nicely into every aspect of being a Shadow Priest. So primarily we're going to be aiming for a lot of haste, and after that we're going to try and get as much crit as we can, and that's going to make sense in a little while. Our Mastery, which increases the damage of Shadow Word, Pain, Vampiric Touch, and Void Bolt, is good, but it doesn't affect every spell that we do, which is unfortunate. And Versatility is just nowhere near as good as Haste or Crit. Obviously, critting with high damage is always really nice, and Crit actually plays nicely into how our talents work. So, Insanity, you can see the bar here. How do we generate Insanity? Well, when we cast a dot, as soon as it lands, it'll give us some Insanity. And in fact, the Shadow Priest and how to play the Shadow Priest actually revolves around knowing like how much Insanity certain things give you, and from there, you can decide when it's time to use different spells. So we have two dots, we have Vampiric Touch, and we have Shadow Word Pain. Shadow Word Pain is instant cast, and Vampiric Touch has a little cast time. That's the only real difference between them. And basically, when do you cast these? You might be wondering that. Well, it depends on how long the mob is going to live, obviously. So if it's going to live for like 5 or 6 seconds, you want to get a Shadow Word Pain on. It's just an instant cast dot. It's going to give you some insanity, all good. If it's going to last longer than that, so it's up to like 8, 9, 7, 10 seconds, things like that, then you might want to throw out a Vampiric Touch as well. Try and always follow a Vampiric Touch with a Shadow Word Pain. Good habit there rather than Shadow Word Pain, Vampiric Touch. Something you just kind of want to get into the habit of doing, so the Vampiric Touch starts ticking that little bit sooner. Just nice little habits like that you want to get into. So we have these two dots, and we want them to keep ticking permanently. As you can see, I track them this way, and I also have an add-on that you'll see in a second, which notifies me if one of them is about to run out. You can see there, it pops up here, it says, hey, you got 5 seconds left on your Shadow Word Pain. You can refresh it now, right? And it'll do the same for Vampiric Touch there. You see that, the way it does that? Just so we can keep our dots up 100% of the time. Well, on top of that, we also have Mind Blast, okay? Mind Blast generates 15 Insanity. I have 2 charges of it, but that's from a Legendary Belt. Typically, you will have 1. So Mind Blast is something we want to keep on cooldowns. You can see it has a relatively long cast time compared to, say, certainly Shadow Word Pain. And that's something we want to keep on cooldown. Now, as we do this, and we also have Mind Flay, this is our filler spell, okay? Mind Flay ticks as it channels, right? It might be hard for you to see. I can see it, but I know some people, especially on YouTube with compression, can't see it. But you can actually see there's little markers along here where Mind Flay actually ticks, and you can see it doesn't do like 1 bolt of damage. It does damage over the course of the cast, and these are the ticks that it actually does, which means you can cut off Mind Flay without losing a lot of damage, right? You can stop doing it, and you've already got the most damage out of it. So although it does have a full channel time, it's doing damage all the way through there. So you're fine to stop that. So what you'll end up doing is something like keeping dots up like this, and then casting Mind Blast, Mind Flay, and then your Mind Blast will go off cooldown, and you'll start casting it, even though Mind Flay hasn't finished, and that's not going to hurt you too much. So now we've generated a lot of Insanity. What are we going to do with it? Well, then we get what this spec is all about, which is casting Void Eruption and going ham and calling upon the powers of Cthulhu to enable us to go crazy. So the Shadow Priest is an interesting one, and anybody who's leveled a Shadow Priest in Legion will probably let you know, unless they were overgeared, that it's not the most enjoyable experience. In fact, playing a Shadow Priest outside of Void form, which is what we'll be moving into, is actually very, very weak until high levels of gear. And out in the open world, obviously, the way Void Farm works means you can't stay in it very long, so it's quite difficult to level. A lot of priests will recommend you level as Discipline, in fact, which is a very interesting thing, considering this is the damage dealing spec. So what does it do? When we go into Void Farm, our insanity is going to start draining away. But what it does do is increases our damage dramatically, and it also starts giving us this stacking buff. You can see it here, and it just ticks up. It doesn't matter what spells I cast. This is on a timer. So the longer we stay inside Void Farm, the more and more stacks I get. And this increased my haste. So as we're playing here, you're going to notice... Don't worry, I'll explain this spell later. You're going to notice that my insanity bar here is draining away. It's disappearing. And over time, it's going to be draining away faster and faster and faster because the game is trying to pull you out of Void Farm. And Shadow Priests are all about a very simple idea. Stay in Void Farm as long as possible, because while you're in Void Farm, you do dramatically more damage, you get way, way more haste, so your spells go faster. You'll notice now my Void Bolt is starting to get very, very short cooldown, as is Mind Blast. I'm starting to generate more and more tentacles from my artifact weapon, but my insanity is fighting me to get away. Yeah, it's fighting me to get away. And when your insanity does run out, which it eventually will do, quite simply, you're going to have to rebuild your insanity to go back into Void Farm. So there was a couple of spells and changes that happened there. When we went into Void Farm with our Void Eruption spell, a couple of things happened. One, Void Eruption detonates the dots that you have on the target. Not for a great deal, but it's a little bit of extra damage. And also, it activates new spells that don't exist until you're in Void Farm. So we have Void Torrents, for one. You raise your dagger into the sky, channeling a torrent of void energy into the target for 1.1 million shadow damage over 4 seconds. Insanity does not drain during this channel. Okay, so it pauses your insanity drain, the drain effect, where the game's trying to pull you out of Void Farm, and does tremendous damage. And with certain set bonuses, it does all kinds of cool stuff as well. So this is your hardest hitting ability once you're into Void Farm, and it's something you want to use very, very quickly. Not only that, but Void Eruption itself, the actual button we press to go into Void Farm, and I'll show you here now if I just get the dots ticking. Once we actually go into Void Farm, it's going to change into a different spell. Watch the icon. Boop, and it's now Void Bolt. Now, Void Bolt, as you can see, I'm tracking it here, has a very, very short cooldown. It starts at 3 seconds, but as your haste builds up, it is modified by haste. This is the Void Torrent there that you saw. It will get quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker and quicker, right? And this is what makes this spec so enjoyable, is when you get to the ability, or when you get the skill level and when you get the gear level to go alongside it, to be able to get these spells to go faster and faster, and the spec really sort of takes shape and starts kicking ass and taking names. So Void Bolt generates the most insanity for it's the biggest bang for the buck you've got, and it's it's the spell you want to be using off cooldown all the time. It hits very, very hard. Yeah, you can see it hits for about 1 million with crits, and it generates the most insanity possible. Now, obviously, our goal here is pretty simple. We want to stay in Void Farm as long as humanly possible, which means we need to make sure we're prioritizing the spells that allow us to generate the most insanity, because the more insanity we generate, then the more there is to drain away and the longer we last in Void Farm. So Shadow is actually a very, very simple idea. It plays very well, especially in raids and stuff where you've got good gear and you can basically pop out of Void Farm and go straight back into it. Makes it very, very enjoyable. So those are the basics of Shadow. We use Shadow of Pain. We use our 2 dots, Shadow of Pain, Vampiric Touch, Mind Blast, and Mind Flay to generate insanity. Then we pop into Void Farm, and then we get access to 2 extra spells, which are Void Torrent and Void Bolt, and we stay there as long as humanly possible, right? And this is where the skill comes in. So you can do things like multi-dotting, making sure you're keeping this up. So Void Bolt itself... Void Bolt extends. I think I have to get into Void Farm to actually show you this. So if I go into Void Farm here and pause it, you can see Void Bolt here. It extends the duration of your dots, making it very, very useful. So if I do some multi-dotting, you see what you can end up doing as a Shadow Priest is this cool stuff like the firing Void Bolts at different targets and extending the duration of dots. And you can keep dots ticking on multiple targets. And this is where you really start to see Shadow Priests, and especially good Shadow Priests, start to elevate their gameplay really nicely, because they're able to manage this stuff with multiple targets, and we cause all these wonderful spirits to come out and help us at the same time, which I'll explain shortly. So you can kind of see where the fun comes from. This gets very, very intricate, very complicated, and also very satisfying and very rewarding to play. So what other spells do we have access to? We still have our offensive Dispel, making us very, very useful in certain situations where we can remove very powerful buffs from various targets. We have Dispersion. Dispersion's not as powerful as it used to be. It's only on a 1.3 minute cooldown now, but it disperses you into pure shadow energy for 6 seconds. It reduces all damage you take by 60%, which is still good, but you are unable to attack or cast spells. That's not very good. Castable while stunned, feared, or silenced. That is good. It clears all snare and movement impairing effects. That's good. It makes you immune to them while dispersed, so you can't be slowed again. Void Form does not drain insanity while dispersed. Now, this used to be a bit of a bamboozle some people used to do, is earlier in Legion's life, if you popped into Dispersion, it would stop you losing insanity. Again, the game trying to pull you out of Shadow Form, but it would still allow you the clock to keep ticking to building these stacks, the Void Form stacks. It no longer does that. It does pause the effect of draining insanity, but it won't gain you any more stacks. So I'm just going to show you that now. If I pop into Void Eruption, you can see the clock's ticking now. It's building my stacks. If I pop into Dispersion, you can see my insanity stopped draining, but the clock has stopped ticking. Right? So it's basically like hitting a pause. It's like hitting a pause. And as soon as I come out, the clock starts ticking again, and it's going to keep building my stacks higher and higher and higher. So that's something you very much want to be aware of. We still have Fade to reduce our threat. Very handy when we're multi-dotting fresh adds and the tank's not picked them all up. We can fade and dot them all up, and we're doing damage to them without being in any trouble. Master Spell is still there. Shadow Priests generally are the people who get called upon to do Master Spell. Master Spell costs us mana, which isn't a resource we really need for DPS, and therefore we can cast it without much punishment, while the healers actually manage their mana and stuff, right? Because it's only a 15-second cooldown for us, and as you can see, your mana, which you can kind of see at the top of my bar here, is pretty much regenerated by the time Master Spell comes back around. Mindbender or Shadow Fiend. It's an extra damaging spell, or you can talent it into Mindbender. You can see that it generates insanity each time the Mindbender attacks. We'll talk about that more in the talent section. Power Word Shield. We do have the ability to Power Word Shield ourselves. Be a little careful if you've got a Disc Priest, but most of the time it won't be an issue. But we generally use this for movement speed, and we'll look at that in the talents so we can quickly get out of situations or maybe pre-shield ourselves in any scenario where we're about to take big damage. We can still cure disease. We still have Shadow Mend, which is our self-heal, all right, should you want to self-heal. Obviously, hybrid self-healing these days is nothing like it used to be, but that is still in the game. We can CC, we can res, we have Silence on a 45-second cooldown, which is just the fucking worst. But that interrupt there, particularly if you have something like Cephas' Secret, where you want to proc this and get all that extra haste. As I told you, our stat priority is haste, so being able to proc Cephas and get a lot more haste, that's pretty goddamn good. A big cooldown that we should talk about is Vampiric Embrace. This is actually super useful in a lot of scenarios, and you'll often find, certainly as raid encounters get harder, or Mythic Pluses get harder, is Vampiric Embrace will be making its appearance. The healers will be requesting that you use it at certain points. Fills you with the Embrace of Shadow Energy for 15 seconds, causing you to heal a nearby ally for 40% of any single target damage shadow spell that you deal. So you pop it, and your DPS actually just heals the group. Very, very useful. Super useful. You want to be aware of it. 3-minute cooldown. Again, it's one of these spells that Shadow Priests like, well, I don't heal. Like, it's just stupid. Like, a good Shadow Priest would be like, do you want my Vamp at any point? Because it's one global cooldown, and it can put out a huge amount of healing with the amount of damage Shadow Priests can do during their Void windows. But that's about it. Now, Mindset. When Mind Flay deals damage, if that target is afflicted by Shadow Word Pain, it deals 36,000 damage to all nearby targets. So, for some reason, Blizzard felt it was too many buttons to have an extra AoE button for Shadow Priests. So they came up with this. They just baked it into Mind Flay. So all this means is as long as a target has Shadow Word Pain on, if you cast Mind Flay, it starts AoEing. You can see the way it's hitting that target? That's it. And it generates 1 insanity per target hit. So this raises a lot of questions with new Shadow Priests is, well, what am I doing? When do I start, like, doing Mind Sear over other things? And the easiest way to think about it is how much insanity does it generate? Because all we're about with Shadow Priests is generating insanity. Generates 1 insanity per target hit. So the more targets it hits, right? And this is based on it ticking, the Mind Flay ticking. So this actually generates quite a lot of insanity, is when we decide that. So at 4 targets, right? At 4 targets, it replaces Mind Blast. And above that, you're going to get more insanity from a Mind Flay or a Mind Sear than you are from Mind Blasting. But you're still going to want dots ticking because they work in all kinds of different ways that we'll talk about in a second. One of those is Shadowy Apparition. When your Shadow Word Pain damage over time critically strikes, so now you can see why crit comes into play, right? You also create a shadowy version of yourself that floats towards the target and deals 42,000 shadow damage. So no doubt you've already seen these. If you didn't see them earlier, you should have seen them in the background, but you can see them here. You can see the way these little apparitions just float off, and when they hit, they do extra damage. And we can also talent them to help us out with our insanity generation. So when it comes to anything with the Shadow Priest, it's what's going to give me the most insanity. Because the longer and the more insanity I have, the better and more damage I will deal. It's a very simple process that you can actually just check the spell and go, oh, okay, that gives me 1, but it's every time it ticks. And I showed you earlier that Mind Flayer has many, many ticks. Okay, but I can kind of work that out now. It's a very simple process. So let's look at our talents that go alongside this then, shall we? Twist of Fate is pretty much the choice in nearly all scenarios. After damaging a target below 35% health, you deal 20% increased damage. Hard to argue, especially with the amount of HP a lot of things have now. Like, even if it's Mythic Plus, that means you're regularly... I mean, you get this buff for 10 seconds. Killing trash means you're going to have this buff up a hell of a lot as you're moving through. Tyrannical bosses, on the flip side, they're also below 35% health for a really long time, which means you're getting this huge execute-style damage that's coming from Twist of Fate. Generally speaking, it just works in so many different scenarios that it's worth picking up. Fortress of the Mind, though, Mind Flame and Mind Blast deal 10% more damage, you generate 20% and more insanity. Now, there are certain legendaries in the game that might make this relevant. Most of them don't apply to anybody unless you get them. I believe a ring is the big one that tilts this over. But for the most part, you're going to take Twist of Fate. Usually, Fortress of the Mind is not worth doing, but I would look into it once you get higher gear and you start getting some choices of legendaries as to whether it slightly tilts you over into being more beneficial. But I'm talking slightly. Depending on gear setup, it might not even count at all. Shadow of Void, unfortunately, is not worth taking. So what you get is this 20-second recharge, 1.2-second cast, so very fast. Blast the target's mind for not a lot of shadow damage. Generates 25 insanity, max 3 charges. With the way you set up a Shadow Priest these days, this just does not come into play, which is really unfortunate. It just does not come into play as being useful because the recharge rate is just so long that it doesn't work well in any scenario, which makes it really bad compared to just a flat damage buff. Moving down, you get Body and Soul is pretty much what you're always going to be taking, which is the movement speed. You can take Masochism, though. When you cast Shadow Mend on yourself, its damage over time effect heals you instead and reduces all damage you take by 10%. So if Dispersion just isn't enough, and you're certainly doing some content, so when you're looking at very high Mythic Plus, if you manage to get there, some things can one-shot you at that point, regardless, and therefore taking 10% less damage could actually be vital, and certainly some raid encounters. Most of the time, you're going to be taking Body and Soul, so your Power Word Shield gives you a zoom, so you can reposition quickly and continue to DPS, but be aware that Masochism can reduce your damage taken by 10%. L45, it gets some CC. Most of the time, you're going to be taking Mind Bomb, so you can stun mobs. Very useful, like a week like this week, which has Necrotic, being able to stun the mobs down so they stop giving Necrotic to the tank. Super helpful, super useful. Let's look further down then. Level 60. Void Ray. Void Ray should be better than what it is. Each time your Mind Flayer and Mind Seer deals damage, you gain 10% increased Mind Flayer and Mind Seer damage for 6 seconds, stacking up to 4 times. The problem is, Mind Flayer becomes less relevant the higher up we go, unless like things are dying super quickly and you're not being able to maintain a lot of Void form, right? Which is rare. You'll be past those levels hopefully very quickly. As the game works now, providing quite a lot of decent higher item level gear from relinquished tokens and stuff, you'll be past the point where Void Ray is useful pretty goddamn quickly. It's not bad if you're just bursting down little mobs, but generally speaking, you can probably tell now when you saw me use Void form earlier, that Mind Flayer becomes less and less and less of a thing. Reaper of Souls. So this is generally taken when you're using Surrender to Madness, which we'll talk about later, and is a big point of contention for a lot of Shadow Priests. Shadow Word Death is now castable on targets below 35% health. So Shadow Word Death is our execute ability. It's a Word of Dark Binding that inflicts 300,000 shadow damage to the target. It's a 9-second recharge. It's only usable classically on enemies that have less than 20% health. It generates 15 insanity, though. It generates 15 insanity, or 30 insanity if it kills the target. Now, that's not kills the target within, like, 10 seconds. If it kills the target, so it's like 1 second or something. But generally, it's an extra insanity generator when the target is below 20% health, which works really well with Twist of Fate, obviously. You can see how these things sort of pair together and synergize really nicely. Reaper of Souls, though, is really good if you're using Surrender to Madness, because you get to use it above 35% health, and Surrender to Madness is about being in Void form for as long as humanly possible. Having access to more insanity-generating resources is really quite nice while you're doing that. Lingering Insanity is pretty much the default choice, though. At this point in the game, it's pretty much the default choice. When Void Form ends, its haste bonus fades away 2% every second instead of ending immediately. So without Lingering Insanity, if I take, combat, if I take Reaper of Souls for us here, if I just run away a little piece, get out of combat, okay. If I take Reaper of Souls, what you'll see is I showed you earlier that this, when you're in, if we get into there, let's get into Void Eruption. So you can see I'm generating stacks now. Now, I'm not trying to generate a lot of stacks here, so I'm just going to let my Void Farm just tick away. You can see I'm generating this haste buff, right? This is Void Farm, so it's giving my haste by 9%, and it just keeps going up 13%. Each one of these is more haste. But when Void Farm ends, it just disappears. Right? It's gone. All that haste is gone, and my character immediately, like, slaps the brakes on itself. That's what's happening. It immediately slaps the brakes on, and all that glorious haste and pace and urgency and speed that you were enjoying in Void Farm just disappears. Now, if we have Lingering Insanity, however, what this does is mean we can maintain that speed while we build back into another Void Farm, which means we spend way, way less time outside of Void Farm. So if you watch now, if I generate some in stacks here, you only need a couple for this. So you can see my Insanity starting to drain away. You can see how slowly it starts draining away. It really is quite slow to start off and gets faster and faster and faster. But when this disappears, this will switch into a new buff and actually keep that haste. You can see there it is, Lingering Insanity. So I get all this extra haste while I build myself up to the next Void Farm. So the longer I stay in Void Farm, the higher stacks of Lingering Insanity I get, meaning I'm quicker getting back into Void Farm. So hopefully the strength of that makes a lot of sense now. Level 75 then. Shadowy Insight. I thought this was going to be the best for a long time, but it's just not. It's too random, and random isn't nice when we're trying to maintain something that is meticulous and precise as trying to stay inside Void Farm. So Shadow Word Pain periodic damage is a 10% chance, you can see already, it's not a lot, to reset the remaining cooldown on Mind Blast and cause your next Mind Blast to be instant. Now, particularly if... the problem with spells like this is that sometimes they proc when Mind Blast is off cooldown or about to come off cooldown, so it's of zero benefit whatsoever, pretty much. And it can not proc when you need it to, which makes it a real pain in the ass. Especially when we're in longer Void Farms, is our Mind Blast is becoming so quick. So quick that it becomes less and less and less and less relevant. Auspicious Spirits is what you're going to be taking most of the time, certainly as your gear gets better. Your Shadowy Apparition now deals 100% increased damage and generates Insanity. So the more crit we get as our stats get better, all these little spirits, if I just generate a couple here, all these spirits that travel to... I'm not getting any crits now, of course. There we go. All these spirits are giving me Insanity. You can see it just getting these little blobs as it goes up. And as the better your gear gets and the faster your dots are ticking because of all that haste, right? All this stuff that's happening with Void Farm, the more Insanity this generates for you, which keeps you in Void Farm longer. It also helps you get back into Void Farm quicker. It just works out really well. However, in earlier gear, you might benefit far more from Sand Lane. Increases the damage of Vampiric Touch by 20% and the healing of Vampiric Embrace by 20%. So this Auspicious Spirits gets better with better stats. I mean, that should be pretty obvious to most people. So in very, very early gear, if you're just starting out, you might be better off with Sand Lane. Just getting this flat damage buff rather than the spirits not critting or your Shadow of Pain not critting enough to really give you the benefit of this. Then you're not seeing the big results that you'll get from Auspicious Spirits. But as you get better up, you'll certainly want to switch over. But Sand Lane should also be considered because of the extra healing it does for Vampiric Embrace. You should always be bearing that in mind. As you really need to help out your group's healing, Sand Lane might be the way to go because you can buff the healing on your group and be a useful member of society. That's always nice. Level 90 then. Level 90, Power Infusion was the best up until not too long ago. I believe 7.3 switched this out. Infuses you with power for 20 seconds and increases haste by 25% and increasing Insanity generation. Now, this will depend on your gear. The issue that Shadow Priest will point out, and somebody will no doubt argue it down below in the comments, is once you get certainly the new 4-piece, as you can see here, the new 4-piece, Insanity drains 10% slower while in Void Farm. It creates a synergy with Mindbender where you can do extremely long Void Farms and also line them up pretty much perfectly with the Void Torrent's cooldown. So Void Torrent is what you can only use in Shadow Farm. I talked about it earlier. But Void Torrent itself does have a 1-minute cooldown. But if you've got the new 4-piece and stuff and your gear's really getting quite good, is that you could basically guarantee your Void Torrent is coming back off cooldown every time, and Mindbender makes that happen. So most Shadow Priests are going, you've got to take Mindbender. However, if your gear is not quite up to that level, you're not going to see that kind of synergy and benefit. So that's something you want to bear in mind. Misery, Vampiric Touch also applies Shadow of Pain onto the target. Now, if you're in open world, like I talked about earlier, I'm taking Misery because I want to put double dots on most targets. So I'll multi-dot everything that I'm pulling for world quests and stuff like that, or leveling. And this saves me just a ton of time while I'm doing that. And I don't spend enough time in Void Farm in the open world to benefit from fucking Mindbender. It's as simple as that. So there's always a time and a place for it. But certainly in raids and dungeons, you would not take Misery under any circumstances. If your gear is really weak sauce, Power Infusion is a good crutch to keep at least your first Void Farm of the fight doing quite well. So about 20 stacks of haste or something like that, or less depending on your gear. You could pop Power Infusion, and what it's going to do is increase your haste by 25% and increase insanity generation by 25%. So here's an important point I think we should mention here. As I showed you earlier, your insanity drains away faster and faster over time, which means it's trying to get you out of it. But at the start of your first Void Farm, it's actually really, really slow, that we showed earlier. It doesn't want you to leave super quick, but it does want you eventually to leave, because if you stay in Void Farm forever, your haste will go to like 100% haste, and you'll just go into lunacy mode, and you'll stay there, and that's a problem. And it's a problem Shadow Priest will tell you all about that started Legion. This means that cooldowns like Mindbender don't work like they do for a lot of DPS classes, which is like you want to smash all your cooldowns and get them on cooldown as fast as possible. For a Shadow Priest, you have to bear in mind, when am I going to get the most benefit out of it? And obviously, if I have an extra cooldown like Power Infusion or Mindbender that's going to generate more insanity for me, that is far, far more beneficial when my insanity is starting to drain away much quicker, right? That's far, it makes common sense. So what you do is you wait until it's worthwhile to stop, to actually fire off this cooldown to get the benefit. You can see how quickly my insanity is trying to drain away at this point. It's just trying to pull me out as fast as it can, and I'm battling it, absolutely battling it to stay in there. So if you have cooldowns like Mindbender and all that kind of good stuff, then you want to be saving them. Similar with Power Infusion. Wait until the point where your insanity is starting to become a problem, then pop Power Infusion to prop yourself up and get much longer Void Farms, because that's what we're after ultimately. Level 100, Shadow Crash, pretty much never going to be taken. You hurl a ball of slow-moving shadow energy at the station, dealing 700,000 shadow damage to all targets within 8 yards and generating 15 insanity. It sounds pretty good, but compared to everything else, it's not going to be worthwhile. And that's generally the issue with some of these talents. Legacy of Void is pretty much the default choice at this point. Void Eruption may be cast anytime your insanity level is 65 or higher, and Void Form increases shadow damage dealt by an additional 5%. So the big thing there is the additional 5%. What you've probably already noticed is once your gear gets reasonable, you'll start to see this with every upgrade, is getting back into Void Form becomes easier and easier and easier, particularly with Lingering Insanity that we talked about earlier. So with that said, Legacy of the Void just giving this big extra damage, both from being able to certainly get into Void Form that touch earlier. I mean, the touch earlier isn't that important because your insanity drains so slowly at the start anyway that you're going to overcap it. But basically getting this extra damage buff is just the best to go. Surrender to Madness then. The gold bastard child of the Shadow Priest, unfortunately. Surrender to Madness is the most fun talent in the entire game. And completely broken. Utterly broken. And broke Shadow Priest for the longest time in Legion. And of course, Blizzard had no choice. Well, they did have a choice. They shouldn't have put this talent in the game. I said this in the alpha. This talent was too ridiculous and way too fun. And far too powerful. So what does it do? It's a 10-minute cooldown. All your insanity-generating abilities generate 100% more insanity. And you can cast while moving until you exit Void Form. Then you die horribly. So it does kill you. It does kill you, but what it does do allow you to do an extraordinarily long Void Form where your stacks get stupid high and it's crazy, crazy fun. It really is. The problem is, of course, is that you die and you can only use it once per fight, and if the fight is anything less than, if the fight's over 3 minutes, everything else gets better than Serenity Madness. So Serenity Madness is what Shadow Priests generally use for fun on fights that you're absolutely going to obliterate into the ground. I would suggest anybody trying out a Shadow Priest just to do this for fun. Even if it's in LFR, go Serenity Madness and just enjoy how fucking crazy this is. Again, because you're trying to keep this exceedingly long Void farm, Reaper of Souls is very, very handy to prop that up. What you'll notice is that your spells like become instant cast. You can obviously run, you can move and cast, so you can just run around spamming spells. You become an absolute lunatic. You do multiple Void torrents and stuff. It's really a lot of fun. Legacy of the Void, though, is the default choice, unfortunately. Unfortunately, I love Serenity Madness. I absolutely find it a joy to play. But unfortunately, at the moment, it's just no longer worth it, which Blizzard kind of intended. So, getting to the gameplay then. I have explained most of it, and hopefully a lot of it now makes sense as to what you're going to be doing. Mind Blast, obviously, is the best insanity generator we have. It's something you want to keep on cooldown. We want to get our dots up, and we want to build our insanity until we can go into Void Farm. When we're in Void Farm, we want to get our Void Torrent going. Yeah, and from now, we're going to be using Void Bolt, Mind Blast, anything we have that's the most efficient use of generating insanity, and from there, we're just going to keep it going. We use Mind Flay at any point we don't have anything to cast, just to generate some insanity, and remember, we break it as soon as possible, just to keep this baby going. Now, the cool stuff is when you start multi-dotting and mixing in your mind benders and things like that. That's when the spec really starts to shine and take off. Using your Void Bolt to extend dots on multiple targets, keeping those targets multi-dotted as much as possible, is all what makes the Shadow Priest a joy to play. That's where the real fun is. So I would practice with this. Get good at managing your multiple dots and all the fun you can have with it. And try and get like huge Void farms. You're going to have a great lot of fun. But you can see I'm already back into Void Farm. You see that? How that lingering insanity just pulls me back in, and you can keep going. You can see that my Void Torrent's pretty much back off cooldown now. It's a pretty insane setup once you get going that I think a lot of you will crucially enjoy. Now, I'm trying to avoid using Shadow Word Death here because ordinarily I wouldn't be able to do that, but you get the idea, right? It's a crazy, crazy fun spec that I hope you people check out. And please, go and play Serenity Madness. I guarantee you this spell's disappearing at some point. And we're probably not going to see a spell like it ever again. Because it's so broken. And it was so broken when it was announced. That I have no doubts whatsoever Blizzard's going to do away with it. And we'll have to deal with something else in the meantime. And yeah, rip the fun, unfortunately. But find your timings. Find where your Shadow Priest is. And you'll feel the growth of your Shadow Priest over time. As you get to do longer and longer Void farms, you get to do them more and more regularly, and you get to fill up and keep going with fun. In conclusion then, the Shadow Priest is just, it gets better over time. It's a very weird one, the Shadow Priest. It starts badly. There's no getting away from that. In very early gear, leveling and stuff, it's actually a chore. I think so anyway, and a lot of Shadow Priests do agree with me. Like I say, a lot of people recommend leveling as discipline and stuff. But you can get over that hurdle. And once you get over that hurdle, what you find is something that actually plays really, really nicely. And you can have a lot of fun with lots of little micromanagement going on that's got this satisfaction that's hard to find in a lot of other classes. There's a Shadow Priest who's Void Bolting multiple targets that have all got dots on, and there's spirits flying everywhere. Or there's like a Ret Paladin who's just pressing Divine Storm. There's a big world of difference out there, and that's something I recommend. Any add-ons specifically for the Shadow Priest? You definitely want some way of tracking your insanity to see how things are going, so you can make decisions on when to use your cooldowns, right? So you want something like Tell Me When our weak core is for that, but beyond that, you should be fine. Some Shadow Priests use special add-ons to track dots on multiple targets. You could do all that within weak auras and Tell Me When, though, so I leave that up to you to see what you think is beneficial. All I'm saying is you definitely want to keep a track of what stacks you're at in Void Farm, because that's when you know, like, in your mind, okay, for me, I need to use Power Infusion now. For me, I need to use Mindbender now, and that's going to give me the best possible results, all right? And also keeping an accurate track of those Void Bolt cooldowns when they get closer and closer and closer to that 1 second mark. Ladies and gentlemen, the Shadow Priest. Enjoy.